Okay, hi everybody. So today we're going to start ancient Egypt. We finished the Mesopotamia Valley areas, and now we're going to go into the Nile Valley, which is the Nile River Valley, and the next we'll do China and India after that. So let's get started, and we'll start with the Nile River. So we'll start with the Nile River. The Nile River is it's the world's largest river. Longest river. It's 4,160 miles. Unusually, it flows south to north, and that's part of that is because of the upper and lower Egypt. The upper Egypt, surprisingly, is in the south, in the mountains of Africa. So the river flows down from the mountains northbound to the Mediterranean Sea. This land was originally called Kemet, after the black soil that is deposited when the river floods. But later on in time, the Greeks named it Egypt. Okay, so typically in the summertime, between May and August, the Nile River gets very high from the summertime rains, and eventually it overflows. And when it overflows, it floods, and it floods yearly. And every year when it floods, it deposits fertile silt. We learned about silt before. We talked a little bit about the Tigris and the Euphrates River. And silt is excellent for farming. Flooding occurred more regularly on the Tigris and Euphrates, but the silt is known as the gift of the Nile.
So while the Tigris and Euphrates could be devastating when they flooded to the people of Mesopotamia, the Nile flowed very gently, and some compared it to a bathtub just overflowing with water. So it was not devastating, it was predictable, and that's why it would be called a gift.
So the Nile Delta is right at the Mediterranean Sea area of the Nile River. It's a triangular area of marshland, and it's formed by the silt deposits. In the United States, we have a very similar area, and it's called the Mississippi Delta. And that's the delta of the Mississippi River where it flows into the Gulf of Mexico. So looking back at the map of the Nile River, you'll see the green areas along the river. And those are the very small areas, really, it looks like small areas, where they actually farmed. And everything else was desert. So there was desert on the right and desert on the left, and then there's just real fertile area right near the river where they could farm. The problem with that is they had a hard time always getting the water to the crops. So what they did is they diverted water from the river, called irrigation channels. So they moved the water along the irrigation channels to the nearby lands so that they could better grow the crops. Which one? So as I mentioned in the last slide, the river is in the fertile areas, and then on either side of the river you have the desert. So the desert really wasn't good for much, but it was good for a couple things. And one of the good things it reduced interactions with the peoples, which could be good or bad. So why don't you in the chat come up with a couple good things that could happen from having the desert on both sides, and a couple bad things that could happen by having the desert on both sides. Okay, so now we'll move on, and we should go to, so one of the natural impediments that the Nile River showed the people between the north and the south was the cataracts on the Nile. Cataracts are like white water, so they weren't navigable. So there's only a couple ways to do this. Well, one way to do it actually is you had to have land caravans to get around with the product that you were moving north or south, or you portaged your boats around the cataracts, which probably, depending on how far you had to portage, was a pretty difficult thing because then you were actually moving the boats. A place around here that's very similar to cataracts is the gorge on the Potomac River in Great Falls, where you can go and watch whitewater rafters and so on. And it's not a bad place for a date.
Of course, Mr. Russo, my favorite place to take a date would be when I take my wife to the school by her house where I'm shooting hoops and I need someone to rebound for me. Problem is, sometimes my wife wants to shoot too, and that really takes away from my shots.
So by 3200 BCE, there were two main kingdoms that dominated Egypt, the Upper and the Lower. The Upper being southern Egypt, and the Lower being northern Egypt, which is different than what we would think normally, because you would think that Upper would be north and Lower would be south. But in this case, Upper is southern Egypt, and Lower is northern Egypt. So the kingdoms were united under the rule of Narmer, also known as Menes or Menes, around 3000 BCE. He established the new capital of Egypt at Memphis, and it was the first Egyptian dynasty. If you look at the right, you'll see that the crown of Upper Egypt is the first one on the left. Looks like a bowling pin. The crown of Lower Egypt looks like a chair. So the United Egypt is the bowling pin in the chair. That's what they decided on.
So here we see some more depictions of the crown, and we've got the unified crown now. Over in the other corner, we see Narmer, and he's smiting the king of Lower Egypt. Smiting is just a great word to use. It means killing. Looks like he's beating him to death with a spoon, but it's some sort of rod or mace. So we will divide up Egypt into different periods of time called kingdoms. We start with the Old Kingdom, because it's the oldest, obviously. This is the time where they built the Great Pyramids. So it's known as the Pyramid Age. It lasts for around 500 years. We have the Middle Kingdom, which will last for around 400 years. And in that Middle Kingdom, we do have rebellion and foreign invasions. And finally, the New Kingdom, which we'll cover next class, lasts around 500 years as well. And it ends in 1075 BCE. It's a time when Egypt grows into an empire and becomes very wealthy. So we're not going to expect you guys to know these dates, but you do need to know the order that they come in and what's going to happen within each of the ages, okay, in each of the kingdoms. But you don't need to remember the dates themselves.
So in the Old Kingdom, we have a strong central authority. The pharaoh is the ruler. He's a monarch. He's believed to be a god. He's actually believed to be the son of Re, and Re is the Egyptian god of sun. So he is the sun god on earth. That's their belief. And because it is a theocracy where the government, where the rule is based on religious authority. So in this case, the pharaoh, the son of Re. He had absolute power. He controlled all aspects of life. He had a vizier, which is a chief minister, and he supervised the day-to-day business and the head of a large bureaucracy of the day-to-day business.
We'll talk more about bureaucracies as we go further in this class, but bureaucracy means we have a system of government workers. They're the ones who carry out all the business that needs to be done, make sure everything is running smoothly.
So the achievements of the Old Kingdom, where they built their first pyramids, were called step pyramids. These pyramids were at Giza, and they were huge. And there are tombs of the pharaohs for eternity. And the pharaohs started to build their pyramid as soon as they took the throne. In the Old Kingdom, for the reason of all the pyramids, was also called the Pyramid Age.
So if we think back to Sumer, they also had a type of pyramid, a step pyramid called a ziggurat, but the big difference is that the pyramids in Egypt were actually tombs, not just places of worship.
Okay, so for the pyramids, inside of the pyramid was a burial chamber. That's where they laid the pharaoh. And outside were two temples, basically to guard the pyramid. The amount of stone for a pyramid of one of these larger ones was 2.3 million blocks of stone, mostly limestone, some granite blocks. And it estimated time to make these was 20 to 25 years. So, you know how we complain about, we see the bridges being built around here, or the roads being built. Why can't they do it faster? Just imagine if you were working construction on a pyramid, if they hired you, you had a job for 20 to 25 years to finish it. So the pyramids at Giza were the biggest of the pyramids. These were built by the pharaoh Khufu around 2530 BC. They used about 500,000 pounds of stone is the estimate. And all of this material was moved, imagine this, moved by rope and wood. So they'd put the wood out and they'd tie ropes around it, and then they had who knows how many people at one time pulling on these ropes. Maybe they figured out a way to make the wood slippery so that they would move the stone easier. But some of the wood, some of the stone, the blocks weighed 9 tons each.
And out in front of the Great Pyramids, you can see some of the earlier step pyramids. They kind of blend in a little bit. But these were the earlier pyramids, and they weren't smooth like the ones we think of. So when we look inside of a pyramid, we see lots of different tunnels going throughout it. And a lot of times these were built to hide the pharaoh's actual body. He was very afraid of grave robbers, so he would make sure that his chamber remained a secret so that others couldn't find it and steal his goods and desecrate his body. So this is the tunnel leading inside of the pyramid, and once upon a time the outside of the pyramid would have looked like this as well. It would have been bright white and shiny, but time has deteriorated the pyramid, so they look the way they do now. Obviously the rails leading down and the metal on the steps were to help archaeologists. They would not have been present in the time of ancient Egypt.
So how did they get built? So there's a lot of theories about this, but most likely they quarried the stone from the Nile and brought it downstream. Theories of using the stone blocks along lubricated runways or ramps, like we mentioned in the other previous slide, would have made it a whole lot easier to move it. And they had ramps and levers that probably lifted the stones. They also had people pushing and pulling on those things probably as well back then, because they didn't have mechanics. Typically they were built, they think, by 20 to 35,000 people. And these people would need to be fed, housed, and provided other amenities to keep them healthy. And probably had a permanent crew of specialized workmen as well, who could figure out how to do all of the rope and the ramps and the placement of the stones, because everybody has to have a boss, right? So somebody had to be the boss. So they had a permanent crew of bosses, basically, who told the 20 to 30,000, 35,000 people how to do their job. Originally, everyone thought that they used slave labor for this, but they actually didn't. And we'll get into the labor actually later when we get into the another section of the Egyptian history. So what they did is they used a lot of the farmers in the country to do the labor, because during the floods, the farmers had nothing to do. So while the land was flooded until the waters receded, they could take these farmers and use them as labor. And they think that's how they did it with farmers and regular free people and not slaves. They may have used some slaves, but we're pretty sure that they weren't 20 or 35,000 slaves. So it wasn't built by slave labor. So this great Sphinx in Egypt is important because you may have to see this again on the SOL, a picture of it, and they may ask you what this is. So this is the Great Sphinx. It's a body of a crouching lion, the head of the pharaoh Khafra. It's carved out of natural limestone, and at one time was colored, and Khafra had a beard. So the Old Kingdom started to decline, and part of this decline was due to crop failures because they had droughts. Crop failures caused famine because there's no food. And then the cost of the pyramids was sky high with taxes on labor and human lives. And then there were power struggles. And the power struggles were between nobility and priests. And it led to a decentralization of power. And they had constant struggles and civil war in the Old Kingdom. And the pharaoh's power declined.
So this pyramid represents Egyptian society. It was a hierarchy, meaning at the top you've got one person in power, and that power is going to go all the way to the base of the pyramid, with them at the bottom having the least amount of power. So we have one pharaoh who is the king and god of his people. Below them are the priests and nobles. Now, what makes you a noble? You have to own land. Below them are traders, artisans, shopkeepers, scribes, and artists, people who make goods, farmers and herders, and at the very bottom you've got unskilled workers as well as slaves.
So life in Egypt was kind of advanced for the time. People were not locked into social classes. People had to be able to read and write to reach the highest level of social structure. The jobs like commanders in the army, the treasurer, the priests, or the pharaoh's advisors all were sought after positions, obviously. So reading and writing was important. Women held many of the same rights as men. Actually, women could divorce their husbands, which was unheard of in some other areas of the world at this time. And they took 1/3 of their wealth, of the husband's wealth, when they divorced the husband. A little side note on this is that marriages were arranged by the parents, and at the time, the boys were 14 and the girls were 12 when the marriages were arranged. So just imagine what life was like for a young person younger than you who would be married by now.
Like the Sumerians, the Egyptians also created a writing system. For the Egyptians, it started out as simple pictographs, meaning that each symbol represented an idea, and it would eventually evolve into hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics means sacred carving. So it's not like the letters that we use today, which equal a sound. Instead, each picture represents an idea or a thing. We use this slide to show you what some of the hieroglyphs would have looked like, but if you were in middle school or elementary school, your teacher might have had you try to spell out your name using hieroglyphics. That's not the way the system worked. Okay, it did not stand for letters. We'll get that much later. Right now, each symbol would stand for its own idea, its own word. Later on, the Egyptians would create a writing system that was based around an alphabet, where those symbols would become sounds, and they called this language demotic. And the Egyptians wrote on papyrus paper, which came from reeds from the Nile River.
So all of the meaning of hieroglyphics was lost until the Rosetta Stone was discovered. Most of us, and maybe you folks as well, know the Rosetta Stone as a program to learn how to speak a foreign language. That was a big push in the country about 15 or 20 years ago. Everybody wanted to get the Rosetta Stone to learn how to speak a different language. So until the Rosetta Stone was found, the meaning of hieroglyphics was lost on the world.
Looking at the picture of the stone, how many languages does it look like we have there? Go ahead and answer that in the chat. How many languages are we looking at? And you should notice that there are 3 different languages. We'll talk about that.
So the Rosetta Stone was discovered by Napoleon's soldiers in 1799. The same text was written in 3 different kinds of writing. And it took over 23 years to figure it out and figure out what it meant when it was deciphered by Jean-Francois Champollion, a Frenchman, of course. What's lost on this is that what we don't show here, and you'll learn this next year in World History 2, is that this is after, just before that Napoleon was defeated in Egypt and went back to France. But he took the Rosetta Stone with him. Jean-Francois got it, and then he matched the Greek to the Demotic, then the Demotic to the hieroglyphics. So you have 3 different languages in here. You have Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphics. So the Egyptians were pretty advanced, so they developed a science, and they developed a 12-month calendar, a 365-day calendar, and it's only 6 hours off of the solar calendar, which is a huge feat for BCE civilizations. They also came up with a system of numbers, which they used for taxes, because even then taxes were important. They developed what you're all going to love is a system of geometry. If you haven't taken it yet, you'll be taking it soon. So they've developed a system for geometry. They also developed medicines. They had surgery. They knew how to set broken bones. And they also learned, I guess maybe because of the surgery, they learned how to check your pulse. So in the religion of the Egyptians, they were polytheistic, which means they worshiped over 2,000 gods and goddesses. They had gods for the sun, they had gods for the earth. As we mentioned before, the pharaoh was the son of Re, which is the sun god. The only people that really needed to know all 2,000 gods and goddesses were the priests. Most gods had human body and animal heads with human qualities. And throughout the country, they built temples to honor these gods.
One difference between the Egyptian gods and the Mesopotamian gods was that the Egyptians, they saw their gods as being kind in many cases, whereas the Mesopotamian gods were seen as being dark and cruel. And we think that's because of the way the rivers flowed. The Nile was very gentle, so therefore the gods had a more gentle approach to life, where in Mesopotamia the Tigris and Euphrates could be violent, and so therefore their gods were darker and cruel. The Egyptians did believe in an afterlife, and your soul would be judged by Anubis, the jackal-headed god right here between the scale. And they would take your heart, or the metaphor of your heart, and they would weigh it against a feather. If your heart was light, it meant that you had done good deeds, not very many bad deeds. It would be lighter than the feather, and you would get to go off into a good afterlife. But if your heart was heavy, due to all the bad deeds you had committed, it would be heavier than the feather, and you would not receive this afterlife. Instead, your soul would be devoured by a monster, a beast, and you would not have an afterlife.
So the Egyptians believed in the afterlife. The belief in the afterlife was following the Book of the Dead, which is their roadmap basically through life. The Egyptians believed that the dead needed their bodies in the afterlife because they were going to need to use them to get around. And to ensure everlasting life, the Egyptians had to honor the gods, mummify the dead so that the body did not decay, and provide equipment in the tombs for use in the afterlife. So we mentioned that they mummify the bodies, so this is how they do it. And it sounds really cool. So the mummification process means they clean the body from the inside and the out. They remove all of the organs and the intestines. They remove the brain, usually with a hook called an iron hook, and they pull the brain through your nose. So just imagine you got a headache when you wake up someday. Imagine what kind of headache you have. Of course, you'd be dead, so you wouldn't feel it. But they pull it through the nose. I guess they didn't have the wherewithal to cut the skull open, because that would have been the easier way to do it. So they would go ahead and take the liver, the lungs, the stomach, and the intestines and put them in canopic jars. And the jars were then placed in the tomb with the mummified body, or in the body cavity in the jars. And each jar had a protector god. You could see the heads on each of the jars. We mentioned in the last slide, they took the liver, they took the lungs, they took the stomach and the intestines and put those in the jars and either put them in the tomb or in the cavity of the mummy. So the question is then, what about the brain? You would think if there was an afterlife, all the other stuff was cool, right? Because then you could kind of live, but how are you going to live without the brain? Well, they didn't believe that the brain was useful. And typically they just took the brain and threw it away because it had no use in the afterlife.
They thought that all your thinking, your memories, everything like that came from your heart. So that was important to keep around. The brain, not so much.
So to get to all of the bodily things, the lungs, the stomach, and the intestines, first they drain all of the fluids. And then they'd cover everything with a salt called natron. And this dried out the body almost completely. So then they'd do that. They'd wrap the body in linen, sometimes hundreds of yards of linen, so that the body would stay dry once the salt dried it out completely.
And that, of course, is where we get the idea of the mummies and our horror movies from, wearing the linen and coming after you.
So the whole process of taking the intestines and the lungs out and taking the brain out and drying out the body, wrapping it in the cloth, could take up to 70 days. When the mummification was complete, the body was placed in a coffin called a sarcophagus. The sarcophagus was then put into the pyramid.
So here we have a couple different mummies. The big one over here is Ramses. We'll be talking about him next class, but he's in pretty good shape for, 4,000 years old. They could actually tell that at one point he had red hair from his mummy. So here's another mummy. It's not in as good a shape as our last two. You can see the eyes are missing, but he does have a nice smile.
So then the mummies are buried with hundreds of items because they're going to need all this stuff in the afterlife. So anything the person would need to use in life, they would need to use again in the afterlife. Maybe china or silver, or who knows, right? When they open up these pyramids now, the archaeologists go in there, they find all kinds of cool stuff in there. And they were buried with things from weapons to food to clothing, and even sometimes they had their servants buried with them. Because after all, who's going to wait on them when in the afterlife? And also their favorite pet was also often sacrificed and mummified too. So it's kind of like a big game hunter or a fisherman or someone who stuffs an animal, kind of like a forerunner to taxidermy.
And of course, their favorite animal was the cat, which is why we like the Egyptians so much. So when I'm dead and gone, I really don't need a pyramid, but what I'm thinking is that on my grave site, you guys maybe once a week, someone puts some catnip down on my grave, and then I seem like I'm some sort of cat god or something like that. Just make sure you don't put down cat litter, because that would be a problem. And we'll finish the notes off with my cats. Of course, on the left we've got Rampage, and then in the purse is Jenny Cat, no longer with us unfortunately, and we did not have her mummified.